Welcome back, everyone. We're going to be starting our next session over here. Before I start, there are just two announcements I need to make. The previous session, which was by Dr. Ron Ross, is now moved, and it's going to be in the Gemalto room at 12 p.m. And then the OWASP store is also open, so if you need to get your OWASP swags, then make sure you go by the store. I'm actually very humbled and honored to be here to introduce to you and introduce our next speaker, Gene Kim. We're truly in the presence of, stellar superstars. Gene, for those of you who are not aware, he was the founder and CTO of Tripwire for about 13 years, which grew into a company that was about $100 million. Gene is a huge fan of IT operations and how it can enable developers to maximize throughput of features from code complete to production without causing chaos and disruption in the IT environment. He's also an accomplished author. The best-selling book of his is, of course, Visible Ops, a book which sold about 200,000 copies. So if you haven't got a copy of that book, I'd highly recommend that you get it. Interesting piece of information about Gene, without belaboring this any longer, is that his website is actually called the www.realgenekim.com. So he's truly the real superstar, and here he's to talk to us about Infosec and the New World Order. So over to you, Gene.
One, two, three. Is this better? Okay, great. So in 1999, I started my journey studying a group of organizations that we used to call Gene's list of people with great kung fu. Right? These are organizations who talked a little differently, acted a little differently, but most importantly, they had profoundly different operational results than your typical IT organization. They had phenomenal service levels, they had great security, they had a great posture of compliance, and interestingly enough, they had the best project throughput. And so over the years, my mission has become, how do we capture and codify what those organizations are doing differently, and how do we capture their good to great transformation? So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about Visible Ops, but more specifically, I'm here to talk about the platitudes of information security. In the ideal, it can be viewed as a critical capability for the business to help the business prevent security breaches from happening, and then when security breaches do occur, detect and correct quickly. But I think in my journey, the more dismal reality is that information security is probably more likely to be marginalized by the business, incapable of affecting how daily operations is performed, and that we're sort of viewed as the shrill, hysterical people who suck the will to live out of everybody we touch, and who are focused on technical minutia, and are basically bypassed as much as possible in terms of how development and operations are performed. Does anyone have a friend who's ever been called any of those words? Shrill, hysterical. These are some of the worst words I think that have been associated with me. So I'm going to share with you kind of what I've done over the last 10 years, really trying to understand how do we reduce the activation energy around how do we get dev and ops to work together and actually have information viewed as a critical stakeholder and consultant in that process. So just briefly, just to set some context, when I talk about high-performing IT organizations, when we first started doing this research 10 years ago, and by the way, Peter Perfetti was, I think, at MTV Interactive Networks at the time. He was one of them. It was very interesting to see where these leaders came from, whether they came from the ops or security organization. They came from one of three backgrounds. They were either a non-commissioned officer in the military, right, typically E5 or E6. They were a chemical engineer, or they were an auditor. And not just any auditor with green eye shades, CPA, right? It was an IT auditor, right? So can anyone speculate, well, what values do these three professions have in common? NCOs in the military, who give live ammunition to 17-year-olds, right? Chemical engineers and auditors. Anybody? Attention to detail is good. Ties. Yes, that's maybe a superficial one, James. That's very good. Yep. Process. Good. Right. In fact, yeah, it's process, attention to detail. What I came up with was rigor and discipline. Right. Non-commissioned officers give ammunition to 18-year-olds, right? Where what I learned in my journey was that restaurant operations people don't even like giving knives to 18-year-olds because you combine 18-year-olds with knives and raw carrots, you have an accident so high that it makes your insurance liability go way up. Chemical engineers have long, elaborate recipes, and if you missequence them, right, endothermic can become exothermic, and people will lose fingers or worse. And then auditors, they just love controls, right? And I think, throughout my journey, right, I still believe that this was critical in terms of sort of solving the puzzle of what high performance looks like. So after we wrote the Visible Ops book, one of the things that we want to do is really describe quantitatively what does high performance look like. Right, things that you can measure with a stopwatch, a ruler, or a dollar sign. And here's what we found. After benchmarking over 1,300 IT organizations, we found that high performers had the best posture of compliance as measured by the fewest number of repeat audit findings, meaning by a factor of a fourth, right, by a factor of 4. Right, and they were spending 1/3 the amount of time prepping and liaising for those audit activities. Secondly, because they were integrating into the process, not just making it a project. Secondly, they found and fixed security breaches faster. In other words, when security breaches happen, because Murphy does exist, high performers and low performers, high performers were 5 times more likely to have that breach detected by an internal automated control versus a business partner versus the assessor versus a newspaper headline, right? And it was 5 times less likely to result in a loss event. So we got the compliance angle, we got the security angle. They're also more operationally effective. They were implementing and authorizing 14 times as many changes with far better outcomes. The changes failed 1/2 as often, and when the changes blew up, the first fixes worked 4 times as often. And when you measure the 7-1 outage profile, they were down less than 1/10 of the time, right? So very much matches the security find and fix pattern. And then because they're doing such a great job in managing unplanned work and controlling it and eradicating unplanned work, they're spending more time on planned work, right? And so consequently, when they're getting more planned work done, they get more projects done. And at the completion of every project, typically results in one more application and one more infrastructure being deployed. They had more applications in production, 6 times as many more applications. Just briefly, does this resonate with you in terms of what seems to describe a high-performing IT organization? Thumbs up? Okay, great. And by the way, if you're interested in any of these statistics, just email me. I'll send you the slides. It's all publicly available. What our goal was, all right, if that's what high performance looks like, right, what sort of characteristics or cultures do we find in every high performer? What we found early in our journey was that, literally in a 15-minute conversation with one of these leaders, you could tell there's something different about these organizations. I mean, literally, I think we never actually did this, but our assertion was that we could train a high school student to listen for certain keywords, right? And we could actually predict with a high degree of accuracy, we believed, right, whether they're a high performer or not. And the science actually did prove this out, but we never did the high school experiment. We found that every of these high performers had what we call a culture of change management, meaning in any one of these organizations, the only acceptable number of unauthorized changes was 0, exactly, right? And so when we challenge, say, Mike Prospect at New York Stock Exchange, right, it's like, isn't change management bureaucratic? Doesn't it suck the will to live out of everybody it touches? They would say absolutely not, right? We consider ourselves very fast, right? We do over 1,000 production changes with a change success rate of over 99.5%. So our reaction is like, wow, okay, that's not slow at all. That's very, very fast. Secondly, we found that each one of these organizations had a culture of causality. Meaning let's do the anti-pattern. Microsoft, they came out with a study that sort of crystallized this concept for us. They found that when they looked at their customers with the highest service levels and the best customer satisfaction were rebooting their servers 20 times less often than their average customers, and they had 5 times fewer blue screens of death. And so when we saw the statistic, we fell out of our chairs, right, because it very much matched what we saw in our high performers. When something goes wrong in high-performing organizations, they know that 80% of all outages are due to a change in the environment or a change to the application, and 80% of the mean time to repair trying to figure out exactly what changed. So where do you suppose high performance looked first when something went wrong? 80% of outages, issues are caused by change. 80% of the mean time to repair is trying to figure out what changed. So where would they look first in the repair cycle? Change, exactly, right. What do low performers do? They reboot things, right? If something doesn't work, right, reboot the server. If that doesn't work, reboot the server next to it. If that doesn't work, reboot all the servers. If that doesn't work, blame the firewall guy, right, because they're always causing outages, right? And that drives down first fix rates, that drives up mean time to repair. The third thing that we found was each one of these high performers had a culture of planned work, of trying to find variance early before it would cause a mammoth disruption, right? So what Jennifer Bayek, the CISO at Bear Stearns for 10 years, said to me, was like, for us, it's a difference between a low fuel light on a car, right, versus 6 people running down the highway with empty gas cans, right? The trick is when that low fuel light indicator goes on, right, queue up a project for next week, right, so we can fix it in a planned way without disrupting, current activities. So the way you measure that is high performers spend 5% or less of their time on unplanned work. Lower performers can spend 50, 60, even 100% of time or more on unplanned work. How many people here have been in organizations that spend too much time on unplanned work or have a friend? Right, so I was actually, in parts of my journey as a DBA, I was one of the reasons why I was causing unplanned work for other people. So our goal with the Visible Ops book was to really sort of create a prescriptive approach to how do you build these controls and operations and how does security integrate into that. And the reason we thought that was so important was that unlike ITIL, unlike COBIT, those are descriptive frameworks. Those are like a catalog of processes and controls. Right? What we wanted was, well, here are the 4 projects that result in the implementation and operationalization of these controls. And so as mentioned earlier, sort of the surprising kind of consequence of writing that was that it went on to sell something like 200,000 copies where people cared about controls. I mean, how utterly surprising. But it's been awesome. So I had mentioned the benchmarking that we did. We benchmarked over 1,300 organizations, really trying to link controls with performance. And the goal is to say, hey, is there a small subset of controls that you can focus on that result in a disproportionate improvement in performance? And we found that there were literally 3 things that you could ask that predict 60% of performance. In other words, every one of the metrics that I talked about, you can predict, by asking 3 questions and putting them into a spreadsheet. So those 3 questions are: to what extent does the organization define, monitor, and enforce some sort of configuration strategy, right? Saying, here is a known good build for the environment that we have a high degree of mastery over, that security is properly reviewed, and here are the defined ways that the configuration should be deployed, right? That is, again, blessed by everyone in the organization with QA, development, and security. Second is, to what extent does the organization define, monitor, and enforce some sort of process discipline, right? Especially around the change in configuration practices, right? In other words, when security says, hey, we have found 16% of configurations in production don't match the known good states, right? Does the management hold people accountable for truing up those configurations, right? Whether it's application, database, OS, networking, et cetera. And then third is, to what extent does the organization define, monitor, and enforce some sort of controlled access to production? And I used to use as the anti-pattern developers with daily access to production. But as I've been working with the DevOps community, which I believe is actually one of the best hopes for the information security organizations to actually become relevant and integrated into daily operations, that's a kind of a moral sort of like, that's a very messy thing. So instead of picking on developers, I'm picking on DBAs, right? When you have uncontrolled access of like DBAs in production on a daily basis doing direct data edits, right, because of code issues, things like that are actually just, that's a very good indicator there's control issues, right? So these 3 things put into a spreadsheet would predict security performance, compliance performance, operational performance, and project due date performance. Before I go any further, does that resonate with you guys? Do you find that credible? Okay. Awesome. So the goal of science is to explain observable phenomena, deeply held intuitions, and reveal surprising insights. When we did this research, I mean, it sort of really jumped out at us. I was like, yeah, that could be the ticket. So let me tell you a little bit about my darkest moment in my journey, right? That we understood what high performance looked like. We wrote it down and put it into a book. We raised over $1.5 million to benchmark these organizations, trying to link practices with performance. And what I found was that it really didn't create the sort of engagements and the groundswell that I had personally hoped for. So after spending 3-4 years of my life doing this, right, basically I felt like nobody cared, right? And so one of the things that I did about this, in fact, why? So one of the things I've sort of grown to hate in my journey is platitudes, right? So as defined by a banal, trite, or stale remark, like as evidenced by buy low, sell high, right? It's technically probably true, right? It's probably how a lot of wealth has been created, but it doesn't actually tell you how. And I feel like I fell sort of into a platitude. In other words, here's some platitudes for information security. Speak in the language of the business and help foster the right tone at the top and a trusted relationship with the business because we have a genuine relationship with the other stakeholders that's mutually respectful, and then we can be savvy and take advantage of compelling events like the Sony breach, like Anonymous. And because we're going to build a real security program, compliance will become free, and we're going to make security everybody's responsibility, which means nobody's responsibility. Right, and so we're going to drive the compliance program, not the auditors, and so we're going to create a real assess, plan, design, execute, monitor, the PDCA loop. And we're going to build the right control environment, and that will help drive the right outcomes in security and compliance. And that one, last one is mine, right? I think I said that. I know I said that, right? And what I found is it wasn't actually true. And so I found this very disturbing. And one of the things that I did to when I sort of hit bottom, or what I thought was bottom, was I sought some advice. One of my longtime mentors is Ari Bailoff. He was, I met him when he was the CTO at VeriSign. So arguably he was responsible for the availability and security for the single point of failure on the entire internet, right? Had to grow capacity at a scale of 14,000, of which Moore's Law gave him only 10%, right? So an incredible engineering operational feat. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that he wrote the foreword to the second edition of Visible Ops. And so I came to him with this problem. I was like, Ari, how do I get people to care, right? How do I get the business to actually say, hey, there's a huge business benefit for having great controls, and can you give me some help? And in fact, I might have had a PowerPoint presentation when I talked with them. I can't remember, but I think the gist of my discontent was that information security and operations were always viewed as tactical, right? The development people were always sort of viewed as what's going to get us to market. They get the budget. They get to take the shortcuts. They get to make the decisions that result in technical debt for information security and operations. And there's just nothing to do about it. Ari, what can I do differently? And what I found, and I even said, hey, I even did the science, right? Why don't people care? And what he said to me actually was one of the worst things that anyone ever said to me in my life, right? It was actually, I found it personally hurtful. He said, Gene, in 40 years, everybody will understand this. So don't make a moral issue out of it. Just qualify better. And when I heard that, literally, I think I had tears welling up in my eyes because I kind of expected him to sort of tell me, send me on a journey to go seek wisdom, right, and come back when I've learned it. Instead, he said, qualify better, right? To me, it was like he had abandoned me. And literally, I left a wreck. For the next 2 weeks, I was in this fog where I felt betrayed and abandoned. And I couldn't believe that Ari would give me crappy advice like that. But it turns out that was actually probably the most important piece of advice I've ever gotten. And he actually pulled me into something when he was the CTO of Yahoo that opened up my eyes that has changed the entire trajectory of what is now my area of passion. So what he, right, here's what working with Yahoo showed me. And then I saw it again at AOL, then I saw it again at Microsoft, some of the largest internet companies around, right? And then I started seeing it in even typical enterprises, right? And so it's like the guy in Sixth Sense, right? You see the dead bodies are everywhere. And it made me think that, oh my gosh, this is actually a larger problem. I think there's a way to view the problem and communicate the problem that will make people care. So here's what we started to see was from the operations perspective, and I'll talk about security later, is the operations people say, geez, right, I'm pissed off because fragile applications are being continually deployed into production that are prone to failure, right? They're not even designed to run, right? They barely stay up, they're not secure. And when something goes wrong, it takes a long time to figure out what bit got flipped. In other words, and the worst thing is that the detective control of how they detected the drift from standard operations was not a monitoring control. It was a salesperson in Vietnam wondering why ads being served in their market are being upside down and in Spanish, right? And it takes too much time for the organization to restore correct service. There's too much time spent firefighting and being spent on unplanned work, which means that we can't do the urgent work that security is giving us. By the way, they're inflicting this endless hamster wheel of pain for us, which means that our other planned project work can't complete, which means that many of our frustrated customers can't get what they need and they leave. And so our market share goes down, which means the company misses the commitments they made to Wall Street, which means that they will make even more audacious commitments to Wall Street, often dreamed up by art majors, right? And so suddenly, here's what Dev sees. They'll see more urgent, date-driven projects put into the queue, which means even more fragile code into production, right? And suddenly, things that were working before stop working so well. Things that used to take an hour to deploy, take a day, take 3 days, take a week, take 3 weeks, take 3 months, right? These turbulent installs. By the way, is this resonating with you at all? How many people here have a friend who's ever seen something like this? Okay, awesome. Right, so now the deployment is getting more and more turbulent, and the release cycles are now getting so long and so arduous that the business says, hey, look, we're going to lengthen the release cycles, right? So we can amortize the cost of deployment, which means there are even more moving pieces and things changing. So the disaster is even more catastrophic, which means that we need now, every time we do a deployment, the most senior operations, security, and developers just to do deployments, which means we have an ever-growing backlog of important things to do, right? And ever amount of increasing tribal warfare between ops and development, and let alone security. So I guess the big aha moment for me was this point right here, right? Is when the business starts missing Wall Street commitments and starts having to make even more audacious commitments, right? The aha moment for me was like, wow, that's not an operational problem. That's not even an IT problem, right? That's a business problem, right? And I think sort of the relief that I had when I realized, okay, this is what Deming meant when he said survival is not mandatory, right? I felt like our job ends there, right? Our job is to expose this vicious feedback loop, and if the business can't act and put in the right corrective actions, then that's sort of above our pay grade, right? And at this point, we're really, they don't deserve to survive. So that was a big sort of aha moment for me. And what I found was that this one slide has become one of the most effective sort of selling mechanisms of like, how do you sort of show this problem exists, right? And how do you get the collective will and of dev, ops, and security to solve a very big problem that can make a huge business impact. So the way we framed this for years was, this is such a core chronic conflict. It's because dev is motivated to deliver features quickly, which means make many changes, whereas ops is chartered to deliver stable, secure, and predictable service, which means make no changes, right? And so therein lies a kind of core chronic cultural conflict. And there is a way to do both, and I think security is uniquely positioned and has unique expertise, to help break this conflict. And what's interesting to me, right, is that there were also another group of people talking about the problem in the same way, and that was the DevOps group. And so I'm going to be citing some slides by John Alspaugh, who was the VP of Operations at Flickr, and James Wickett, who is one of our illustrious leaders here. I'll tell you a little about rugged DevOps, DevOps and rugged DevOps, and how I'm trying to contribute to that movement. How many people here are familiar with DevOps? About 25%. Okay, so DevOps started when John Alspaugh gave a presentation at the Velocity conference. So that's where the internet online service companies hang out. No, so Yahoo, Google, LinkedIn, they all hang out there, right? And he gave this presentation when he was VP of Ops at Flickr. That sort of rocked the world. He said, we are now at the point where we're doing 10 deploys a day, right? And we're doing this by having dev and ops work together, right? And so, he sort of really painted beautifully kind of the tension between dev and operations. So dev is embodied by Spock, right? And Scotty is embodying operations, right? And where's security in this? Security is sort of like the red-shirted, security guy who goes down on the way party and is always killed, right? So, if you look into the DevOps community, you'll find a prevailing thinking that says, we are a group of people where ops can think like dev and dev can think like ops, right? And there's a whole sort of set of red herrings about DevOps is getting rid of ops, like no ops, right? And I think that is really a red herring. I think DevOps is more about putting ops and security into dev than it is putting dev and putting dev into security and ops. But it is a sort of amazing sort of culture where you have dev and ops harmoniously living together, right? And actually breaking kind of these silos where you're getting phenomenal feature flow of code and environments into production, right, with phenomenal results. Incidentally, the state of the art now, right, Amazon, they gave a presentation that said we are now doing like one deploy every 9 seconds, right? This is not for their cloud customers. This is for the Amazon enterprise, right? So that's 1,000 deploys a day. So DevOps, I think, is just a very promising place for security practitioners to get plugged into. And James Wickett worked with a set of people who are coining this term rugged DevOps, which I absolutely love. Right, it's basically saying, hey, let's take the DevOps mentality, right, and add rugged attributes to it, so that security just becomes one other facet of quality, right, and integrate that into the daily development and operational processes. So the people who developed rugged as a concept is like Josh Corman, Jim. Yeah, it's in my slides somewhere. But it's an incredible sort of, I think, sort of a leap that they made that said, you know what, this is the best way to actually integrate security into every domain of work. And here are sort of the ruggedities, right? It's like our goal is to make applications and infrastructure that's available, survivable, defensible, securable, longevityable, and portable, right? And do it in a way that we can talk to our peers in QA, development, architecture, right? To actually recognize that we have a lot of expertise that we can bring to bear to help them achieve all these goals, of which security is just one, right? And my experience working with the DevOps community is like these guys are ready to have conversations with you, right? If you can help achieve that objective, right, we have a lot to offer. And my proof of this is that when I started working with these internet companies like Yahoo, AOL, and Microsoft, the sponsors and the people who raised their hand first came from a very surprising space, the VP of development. Right, at AOL, there was a gentleman named Eric Passmore, who later became the CTO, had 1,300 developers working for him. And when he saw that sort of feedback slide, he said, you know what? You have put your finger on one of our biggest problems, right? These aren't operational problems. These are my problems. And he said, you know what? We recognize that IT operations, and to a lesser extent security, is our bottleneck, right? We can complete the code. We can do the code commit, but it still takes too long for operations to get the environments ready, right? So code commit then begins a 2-month-long deployment process, which is way too long because environments are never available when we need them, and they're never working correctly the first time. And when we do release, it causes a global disruption, whether it's because of an outage or a security issue that needs to be remediated. And the collective accumulation of technical debt drives up our deployment times. And what was sort of like one of my biggest surprises, he said, when operations can't deploy environments fast enough. In other words, when we can't get to the Linux 2.4 kernel to the 2.6 kernel for 6 months, that was like basically a work stoppage for development for 6 months, right? Because they had so many features that were reliant upon multi-threaded kernels, right? So he said it was just like, I could have given my developers vacations, right, for 6 months. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but when he realized the impact of that to his job, suddenly he stepped in and said, you know what can I do to help? I will give resources, staff, you have my attention, I want to help. From an information security perspective, what better thing to hear than that? So what do these breakthroughs look like? What we are trying to codify, I'm working on 2 books now. One of them is called the DevOps Cookbook, right? And the goal is really to capture and codify how do you start and finish DevOps transformations. And I think a critical piece of that is how does information security integrate into the development processes when they're doing a deploy a day, right? If you're doing a security review and it takes 2 weeks, right? There's a 2 order of magnitude mismatch in cycle times, right? How do we keep up with those deployment rates? So, and then how do you get operations to get ready, right? How do you get operations driven to the earliest part of the agile sprints, right? So we're developing code and the environments at the same time. So in my mind, right, we're reframing IT operations to be not just controlling unplanned work like we discussed in Visible Ops, but really how do we move planned work, right? How do we increase flow of planned work from development into production, and almost treating it like a factory plant floor. And is this consistent with Visible Ops? I think it really is exactly everything that we didn't talk about in Visible Ops. Is how do you treat planned work, make sure that we know exactly what needs to be worked on at any given time, and where is security's role outside of the IT general controls. So I had mentioned there's 2 projects I'm working on. One is the DevOps Cookbook, and the people that we're working with, the team is Patrick Dubois. He's the founder of the DevOps movement. The gentleman named John Willis, who was VP of Services at OpsCode, later GTO Solutions. Mike Orzen, he is the latest Shingo Prize winner for his contribution to the Lean body of research. And the goal here really is, how do we prescriptively show what does dev need to do, security and ops, to match the outcomes that are being shown by people like Flickr, Google, and so forth. I'm going to briefly go through the DevOps part just to kind of give you a flavor of what it looks like. So one of the pilots, and by the way, Ernest, hopefully this will resonate with you and James, because if it doesn't, we have some rewriting to do. But step 1 is like having one person own the value chain from dev to ops, and also owning the security responsibilities, right? So they have one place where all those things meet, and where you can deconflict and make sure that the right feedback loops are happening. Secondly, the notion that dev and ops are now working together from the very beginning, right? You take your most senior ops person, typically who's, I always call them the Brents, right? Brent is the person you need to fix almost every major outage, right? And if Brent gets hit by a bus, right, all work stops, and that's why Brent hasn't been on vacation. You take that Brent and you put them into the dev team, right? And their goal is to, in the very beginning, is at the end of the early sprints, not only to have code that is ready to be deployed, but environments to deploy into. In other words, never again will we be at the end of the project where dev is eaten up all the time, leaving no time for operations and security, right? You'll always have something that we can deploy that will start with the dev environment, will become the QA environment, will become the staging and test and the production environment. Right? It was, I think, a huge breakthrough in terms of the way dev and code are developed now in parallel. Secondly, you take that ops person and embed them into the dev structure, right, where they can actually be in a position, incidentally, and a security person, to describe what operations and security needs in production, right, to support the monitoring objectives, to support the deployment objectives. So they become just like another stakeholder in dev, but they actually have a very special power, right? They can sort of pull the andon cord in the Toyota production plants, right? The expectation is when something goes wrong, you stop the entire assembly line and you fix the issue at the source. You never pass it on downstream, right? The ops and security person in the dev structure has that special responsibility, right, to make sure that we never incur technical debt unintentionally. And then, if you are on, how many here work with organizations where you're using some sort of agile dev process? Yeah, so typically in my experience, the dev sprints, the sprints are sort of like the work periods. At the end of every sprint, it's typically 1 or 2 weeks long. If you actually are doing a great job, you can actually deploy more in shorter intervals in the sprints, right? That you might be releasing new feature sets once every 2 weeks, but you might even give the business the option of being able to decouple and deploy every day, right? And so all sorts of options become possible, right? And you can now even start, there's organizations we're observing that go from a sprint to a Kanban, whereas like we can deploy at will, right? And talk about having security being a necessary part of that. The Dropbox failure, right, where they accidentally deployed something that took down authentication for an entire weekend, right? That was probably a security failure, right? Somewhere in the deployment process, someone probably forgot to turn off a configuration flag, right? That's something that security should have never let happen. And then we talked about putting ops in the dev chain. Now we want to put dev in the ops chain, right? I'm not sure if we actually want to give them daily access to the production environment, but certainly they want to be, they should be put very. You want to move them closer to the front lines. There's a great quote from the founder of Mob Browser. He said, "Waking up developers, we found at 3 a.m. is a great feedback loop, right? We found that defects got fixed very, very quickly, right? And so there's obviously some separation of duty issues that need to be worked out there. But the whole idea is that you can fix things more quickly, right? And that includes security vulnerabilities, right? How great is it that you don't have to wait three months, right, for it to be fixed? It could be fixed the next day, right? I think that's the promise. So I'll talk briefly about the expected outcomes of what it looks like for the business to successfully put in a DevOps program. We're talking about creating determinism and repeatability in the deployment process. We found sort of another sort of key little win, a quick win, is moving packaging responsibility from ops to development. We found that this is a great point where that becomes committed in the repository. It's a great place for security to do the reviews on, and it is actually being now performed by people who have the mastery. We can reduce cycle time, right, of those deployments from, say, 6 hours to 45 minutes, which is what we did with the AOL.com homepage, right, by doing these type of things. Putting in policies that says, hey, whenever something doesn't deploy cleanly from, say, dev to test to staging to production, right, you never fix forward. You never sort of bang on it and make it work. You go all the way back to the end, right, and figure out what went wrong so it doesn't happen again in the future, right? And you hold each one of those environment owners, whether it's dev, test, QA, staging, production, accountable for making sure that all the configurations in the environments are in the known good state. And those combination of things seem to result in sort of like the breakthroughs in deployment times, right, that help development, helps make the operational environment more stable, and makes it more securable. And the second part is really about increasing production rigor, right? How do you get operations in a mode where they're properly elevating preventive projects, documenting all the work so that can be audited and reviewed, and that they're correctly plugging in security when they're doing their work. How am I doing so far? Is this resonating with you? Does this seem like a fairy tale that is completely unachievable? Can you give me a thumbs up saying, keep going, Gene? Thumbs down is like, let's go to lunch early. Okay. All right, I'm passionate about this stuff. I love this. I think it's the last best hope for information security. In fact, let me tell you why. The other book I'm working on, which is something I've been working on for 5 years, that I'm just is like, well, it's called When IT Fails, a Novel. And I want this, the goal of this project is to make the business care, to say, hey, Mr. Information Security, Miss Information Security, what you are talking about is actually some of my biggest problems, and you need to tell me more about what you can do about it, versus being marginalized. And the book that this is modeled on is a book called The Goal. How many people, has anyone here read this book? Okay, this book has had maybe the biggest impact on my thinking ever. It was written by a guy named Dr. Ellie Goldratt, right, who actually passed away this summer. And he wrote this book in the 80s that was essentially a novel about a plant manager who had to fix his cost and due date issues in 90 days. Otherwise, they're going to shut the plant down, right? And so you live through the eyes of Alex, right? And you see these problems and the human cost, right? And then you see as he questions some of the common wisdom, and he realizes everything that he's doing might be taking him away from the goal, right? And for anyone who, I would recommend this book to anybody, except for my wife, who I've listened to the book on tape one too many times on the way to the beach, and she won't let me listen to it anymore. Anyway, so The Goal by Ellie Goldratt. So in our book, right, is a novel, right, with two main characters: the CEO of a $4 billion a year company, and his name is Steve Masters, and the second character is Bill Palmer, the VP of IT Operations, who was recently promoted from being the director of AS400 operations, who's purposely tried to avoid getting promoted for 8 years, but he's been selected, right? And the CEO continually says, we're not Google, we're not Microsoft, IT is not a core competency. Maybe we're just better off outsourcing the whole thing, right? Make all these issues go away. But he quickly learns that none of the promises he's making to the board, whether it's projects, operations, security, compliance, all of those things are completely reliant on having great IT, right, that you can't just outsource. So here's kind of what happens to Bill in the first couple of days. The opening scene is the CEO being raked over the coals by the board because he's missed every commitment that he's made. And maybe they take away his chairmanship, and they say, maybe we need someone younger in this job, someone who actually understands technology. Right, and then so this causes great grief, and so he fires the CIO and his VP of IT operations, and enters the new main character, Bill Palmer, right, is embodied by the Gene Kranz from Apollo 13, which I think is the best embodiment of what great ops looks like. But here's Bill's first 3 days on the job. There's a crippling payroll outage where all the salaried employees got paid, but none of the hourlies, right? Got the CFO put on the front page of the news. Secondly, and they don't know where it came from, right? Which one of the million changes was it? And incidentally, the person making the change was the information security people, right, pushing in a tokenization application, which leads to a very uncomfortable audit meeting where they found that there was 950 IT jump control deficiencies, right, that could lead to a material finding. And then finally, so more reasons why Bill is thinking he might have made the wrong decision taking the job. And the third thing, right, is when he gets thrown under the bus by the VP of Application Development and the VP of Marketing, the evil Sarah Moulton, right, saying, hey, Project Phoenix, the most important project for the company, needs deploy next week. And the operations people are saying, what? Next week? It was supposed to go in next year, right? But essentially, they can't get in the way of the deployment, which results in disaster, including when you go into this new online ordering website. If you empty the shopping cart, it would actually display the last order, including the credit card information and the stripe 1 of the pan. Anyway, so the goal of this book is really to be like the bridge between the business and IT, between DevOps and security, to show that, hey, first the goal is to create empathy, so we know what it's like to walk in the other person's shoes, right, and help create a collective will to solve the problem. I was telling someone earlier today, the vision for this book really was validated for me when the CIO of Columbia Sportswear said, hey, when you finish that book, Gene, everyone on my team will need to read it, Dev, Ops, Security, right? And my boss will need to read it, the CFO, and my boss's boss will need to read it, the CEO. And in my mind, right, that really is, I think the goal behind the book. How am I doing, Tom? Can I go 5 more minutes? 5 more minutes. So let me tell you about the most interesting character in the book for me, right? He's not a main character, he's a secondary character, but in my mind, the CISO is one of the most interesting, complex people in the books. So his name is John Pesci. He's been a CISO for 9 years, he's 39 years old, he's been a very aggressive career climber, he's a ex-Big Four auditor, but John isn't happy, right? He realizes that he hasn't actually slept through the night well for the last 3 years. He's continually haunted by nightmares that he's going to get thrown underneath the bus by the business, right? That he's going to be the fall guy when we have a security breach or when we have an audit finding that's going to fail miserably, and that has happened. And he realizes that his self-image has suffered, right? In his mind, he got into information security because he wanted to help catch bad guys. He was driven by a sense of duty, right? But he realizes that, that's not the way he feels. He feels more like the guy from Office Space, where, he's sent to the basement, no one wants him around, right? And he feels a special sort of like humiliation when he has to beg the project managers to tell him where the developers are meeting because they won't tell him, right? And he's like, I'm doing it for the good of the organization and for the good of our customers, right? And so his kids are going, God, Dad, you just don't seem very happy. And then his wife says, you are not the man I fell in love with, right? I hate the person you've become. And so there are 3 assumptions that John has to question, right, that he holds very deeply. And it turns out that believing this actually leads them to the wrong decisions that make almost all the problems worse in dev, ops, and security. The first one is that information security wins based on how much work we can put into the IT system. In other words, the more budget we can get, the more vulnerabilities we can get closed, the more we can sort of bully the line managers around, the more of that I can do, the better off information security and the organization is, right? And what he learns is that, wow, a lot of his issues, especially in the production environment, actually just create more control complexity in the production environment. It just is papering over sort of systemic problems. And that he realizes his unique gift, right, is that he can understand sort of the business objectives, how the business runs, where the data flows, where you have reliance placed on, where you absolutely need controls because there are no manual controls that can catch security breaches or some sort of error. And that he has a special power that he can shrink the scope of the audits and reduce dramatically how much energy is being spent on just compliance and not making the organization secure. The second thing that he finds, right, is that another core assumption that's incorrect is that information security wins when it meddles with daily work, right? The more we can badger developers on a daily basis, the more we can badger operations, right? The more we do that, the more we win, like this person sort of with a clipboard inspecting every work center in the plant. And then he learns that all these promises that he's kept with for developers and development managers and operations, right, it's just meaningless promises. He learns that he is more like a plant safety officer who shouldn't be looking at individual work centers, but he should be looking at the plant line level. How are the plant lines designed, right? How are workers working? That's where he should be focusing on, and that he will use his unique skills to help the development managers and the ops managers create a DevOps style transformation where you can get all that fast feature flow and increasing stability and security that we talked about before, and help them achieve their goals as well as security goals as well. Third, John believes that any cycle spent on information security comes at the expense of dev and operations. In other words, it's like a zero-sum game. And he comes to learn that by putting in things like DevOps, the caloric load of the organization increases dramatically. In other words, the organization can get so much more work done, there's more calories around for everybody. And so operations becomes more able to deploy and put in infrastructure improvement projects. Development release rates go from quarterly to 3 times daily. And we all agree that the team all agrees that 10% of all ops and dev cycles should be spent on improvement programs, of which security will get a big chunk, right? And that means security objectives are now being done by dev and operations, not heroically by one person. So, and the goal is to replicate the performance we've seen in high performers, right? They have security built into the process, which means great compliance, great security, great operations, and great development throughput as well. So what does it mean for John? So John at the end is a person who realizes the entire organization is applauding him at the Friday beer party for the first time ever. He and his team are actually invited, right? Versus being the only people not being invited, right? And his wife says, finally, you have become the person that I fell in love with, right? Thank you, John. Thank you, rest of the organization. So if you're interested in any of the benchmarking statistics, please give me a card or email me. I'll send that to you. All that information is publicly available. If you're interested in any of these links or having a conversation about DevOps, rugged DevOps, continuous delivery, how to get involved in DevOps, please let me know. And if you're interested in getting updates on the 2 books I've talked about, the DevOps Cookbook and When IT Fails a Novel, just email me or give me a card. And you can even send me a one-liner email with the subject of list, and I'll get you taken care of. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah. March. The due date is no longer running away faster than time.